Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Water Moon Cards. This is Luna, and thank you for joining me today for my wrap-up, long overdue, of the Dame Fortune's Wheel Tarot Exploration through the Drop 'em 78 Tarot Challenge. And I started this back on January 1st of this year and did daily videos almost every day. I definitely covered every card in the deck. And I'll link below the playlist and so forth, so you can go back and watch those shorts or watch my other wrap-ups. What I want to do today is talk about the Triumph suit, the final suit, as well as just some overall takeaways from this exercise. So I hope that's interesting to you. There will be a future video about the tarot of A.E. Waite and his writings on the tarot that he commissioned from Hemlock Coleman Smith. Because I learned a lot comparing this deck with that one in this exercise. But today I'm just going to focus on Paul Hewson's deck and book. And as with my other suit wrap-up videos that I've made in this series, I'm not going to talk about this entire suit of triumphs. I'm just going to talk about certain cards that stood out or maybe gave me a little bit more information on another perspective than my usual one. So let's get into it. And I'm just going to go in order. So we'll start with the Fool card, and this card Hewson interprets as a lunatic, someone who is infatuated, someone who is delusional, out of their mind, someone who is foolish and may not be thinking clearly or thinking in an orthodox way. Someone who's not afraid to speak truth to power, maybe because they don't recognize the repercussions of that, but as we know, that fools in history were allowed to kind of poke fun at the people that were their patrons within, certain limitations. But the court jester and so forth played a societal role in voicing unpopular opinion, essentially, or at least unpopular to the ruling class, maybe populist opinion to those that were in charge. So I like that, talking back, but maybe not always wisely. And he kind of ties in a little bit with what Hewson calls the female pope, also known as the papess or the high priestess here. And I didn't really have too many negative connotations with this card necessarily, maybe just like a roadblock, not being able to understand what's going on, because I see her as a portal, but a silent one. So one where you have to read between the lines, you have to use intuition to understand what's happening, you have to get sort of hints. And Hewson adds on to that this idea of like a fake prophet or someone who is into conspiracy theories or like divergent information that is not true. And I think that's an interesting interpretation, crackpot theories and so forth, not backed up by any kind of lived experience. So that's an interesting interpretation, and it's always good, I think, to have positive, neutral, and negative associations with the cards, because depending on the context, any of those can come out. So I appreciated that development in my own understanding. I also wanted to mention just briefly that I appreciate in this deck that the top figure on the Wheel of Fortune card has ass's ears. So these ears are like a donkey ears, and that mimics, and in some decks the Fool has even more pronounced ass's ears. These are sort of decorations with bells on them, but they're ear-like, and certainly in many Italian decks he actually does have ass's ears as well. So the foolishness of the ruling class is another kind of tie-in between the Fool and another card in the Major Arcana. Next we'll look at Fortitude, and I want to look at this in relation to Temperance. In many decks, Fortitude is depicted as a woman taming a lion. In some older decks, it's depicted as a warrior, sometimes a famous warrior, beating a lion to death. In many modern tarot guidebooks, and this is somewhat based on Waite as well, you will get an interpretation for Fortitude, especially when she is depicted with a lion, as kind of controlling your inner animal instincts, right? Getting hold of your less intentional desires. And I've never really liked that. It always smacked very judgmental kind of dogmatism to me. Certainly coming out of a very dogmatic form of Christianity, and not all Christianity is like this, but I was raised in a very dogmatic form of Christianity that talked about sin, really emphasized sin. Everything was about sin all the time. And I think that's a very negative and can be used in a very manipulative way to talk about our own motivations and things like self-control. And so I prefer to think of fortitude, as strength, as confidence, ability, as the confidence that comes from experience. So this new situation is in front of me. It's hard. I've done hard things before and come through it. It may not be easy, but I'm strong enough to handle it. That's how I like to interpret strength. It can also be something like stubbornness, because if you get too, in your ego about this, confidence can turn into conceit. So there are negative aspects of this card, just like there are of any card. Temperance, on the other hand, I do like to think of as more of like self-control, or looking at a situation and not taking everything so personally, and being able to change the situation by changing your own attitude towards it. That's the alchemical side of temperance, or can be, again, depends on the context. And what I like about his description of temperance is it is about self-control, but it's about self-control that comes from wisdom. It's not suppression or self-oppression or being oppressed from the outside or being told, hey, don't do that. That's not ladylike. That's not good. That's not the right way to act. It's recognizing that if you approach a situation without temperance, things may not go well. So it has to do with an inner strength as well, but it has to do more with your action and your determination to act appropriately and to the benefit of a particular situation. There's a wisdom element to temperance, is what I'm trying to get at. Next, we have a series of cards that is often interpreted one way, and I really like Houston's way of interpreting them, and it's something that I use myself. So we have the Hangman, the Devil, and the Tower. I've left out Death here, which does play a role in this sequence, but the Hangman in Houston's definition, and in most older definitions, what he represented was punishment. Punishment, comeuppance. He was a traitor, and this is how traitors would be hung, as a punishment, by one leg upside down. Houston tries to dispel the myth that this is Judas Iscariot from the Bible. Judas hung from the neck, not from the foot. So even though he betrayed Christ, this is not necessarily a depiction of that story. But what it is a depiction of, I think, so many of us read for ourselves, right? So this can also be a depiction of going against your better judgment. Making the wrong choice and going, ooh, that was not the most skillful thing I could have done in that situation. Or, having regret, recognizing that the bad outcome of a situation was because of, in part, whatever you did or said in that moment. Also taking responsibility for that. So recognizing and going, okay, that was not skilled. That is actually how I prefer to interpret this card. Yes, it could mean different perspective because he's upside down, but that's such a cliched way of looking at this. I prefer look at it differently and take responsibility, take ownership of what's happening. Or, it could also be a feeling of betrayal. So I don't do a predictive reading necessarily and say someone is going to betray you or somebody has betrayed you, but I might say something like you're feeling betrayed, right? You're feeling like this person has not come through for you, or you're feeling like this situation didn't turn out the right way, or the way you would have preferred, or the way that you were owed. So I feel like it has more to do with your interpretation of a situation than it does with actual betrayal most of the time. Again, context, context, context. Similarly with the Devil, Houston's interpretation of this is also more in line with mine, which is not about doing bad things. It's about habitual behavior that we don't even notice. It's about unhelpful patterns that we fall into over and over again because, that was the way we were raised, or that was the coping mechanism that worked for us in childhood in a dysfunctional family setting that we then, just held on to because it was familiar, and now it doesn't work well in our adult friendships or at work or in our partnerships. because it's not actually that healthy. It was born out of neurosis, and so, but now you've continued it on. It can also just have to do with simple things like bad habits, not taking care of your body, not taking care of your mind very well, lapsing back into behaviors that are not great for you. And it can also, for me, have to do with addiction, but I would never like accuse a client of being addicted to hard drugs, for example. It can be a simple addiction of something like always having to have the last word, or wanting to explain away someone's genuine concern or grief with a banal statement. Sort of the habit of not wanting to deal with tough stuff. Things like that. So we're all addicted to certain things in certain ways, whether we recognize it or not. I really appreciated what my teacher said about addiction, a talk that I was listening to a few weeks ago. And he was saying, addiction is anything where we're compulsively doing something that we know that we don't want to do, but we do it anyway. Right? Isn't that, and that's kind of the definition, right? You know that it's bad for you. You know it's not going to have a good result, or you know that it's going to make you feel bad later, or whatever. You know it's going to cause a fight, but you do it anyway because it's a compulsion that you kind of can't control. And that's what I like about this card, because I think that applies to everybody. I think it's more relatable, and I think it humanizes it too. And it helps get around the thing of when you face your habitual behavior, often you feel very guilty about it. And just recognize it instead as a learned pattern rather than having to take on a lot of guilt around it can actually help you break that down. And that's where the Tower comes in. I had a revelation when I read Hewson's description of the Tower, because he mentions that while this is sometimes called the house of God, it's also known as the house of the devil. And so if you're stuck in this, what needs to happen? That house needs to crumble. That house needs to come down. So the Tower in this context is actually a wonderful card to get. It's freeing. Yes, it's scary looking because you're destroying the structure and the familiarity of the bad habit that you're stuck in. And that's incredibly scary to try to let go of that and learn how to be some other way. But it's also incredibly freeing. And if you can do it, then you can proceed. You can proceed on with a healthier way of being in the world, a more uplifting way of being in the world. And then the last three I wanted to discuss were the moon, judgment, and the world. This first one, the moon, Hewson talks about cycles and about things that wax and wane, like the moon and tides. And that's a good reminder for me because sometimes I get a little bit unclear about the moon, which is also about unclarity. So it's kind of ironic that's how I feel about the moon sometimes. So cyclicality can have to do also with the Wheel of Fortune, right? This goes round and round, and this kind of goes up and down, or appears and disappears. And I like that appears and disappears because things, it can be the same thing, right? The moon is always there, whether we can see it or not. So our perspective on it changes. That's the thing that waxes and wanes. It's not the thing itself. It's our understanding of the situation, or our understanding of the person, or our understanding of our own internal process, or whatever we're going through, right? That's the thing that waxes and wanes, and it goes in cycles. Sometimes we understand ourselves very well, and we have very clear ideas about who we are and how we want to be, and sometimes we feel lost and confused and stirred up and agitated, and that's, of course, just sort of the human condition. But I liked that cyclicality as one aspect. He also talks about dreams a lot, and so again, it's nighttime. It's things that happen at night, and dreams are one of those things. So again, dreams, illusions that are in our mind, perspectives on things that are garbled or unclear. Often in dreams, things don't make sense. Even if we're lucid dreaming, we're kind of going, wow, this is so weird. And I think it's a dream because, this person would never do that, or that person would never be in this situation. So it's that kind of unclarity in a dreamlike state where things aren't quite real, and you can't quite maybe put your finger on exactly what's happening. So confusion could be another keyword for the moon. And then we have judgment, and Hewson talks about the final determination of our outcome of a situation. Maybe the world is more the actual outcome, and judgment is sort of how we perceive something. or how we think about it, or how we judge it. Like, oh, this was a success, or this was a failure. I want to do more of this, or I want to do less of that. That kind of judgment. Again, tying in with, the Hangman and Strength and these other cards we've been discussing, assessing a situation and then deciding from there what I could do about it next time. So coming to terms with that. And also just seeing through this kind of confusion. If this is the things aren't so clear, the sun comes out, shines a light on it, and then you can go, oh, that's what it really is. That's what it really meant. That's what really happened. That kind of awakened mental state, wisdom, etc. I would associate with judgment. And then the world, Houston talks about prudence with our snake here. We don't have prudence as its own separate card in the tarot, but it's implied here, and this is based on a historic image. Just like the other virtues in this deck, the figure in this world card has this octagonal type halo around them, and that indicates that they are a cardinal virtue. So if we take the world as prudence, which is about carefulness, but again, it's not about the suppression of, oh, be careful. It's about wisdom, that we understand the consequences of our actions or our potential actions or our thoughts or the way we speak to others. If we do have a good understanding of that, of ourselves and the world and how everything operates and how everything is interconnected, then we can move about that very skillfully. It can feel like we're on top of the world because we know we have a pretty good idea of what the outcome of our actions is going to be, at least in the short term. And I like this idea of the internet connectedness of everything too. I'll share a story that one of the senior students in my Sangha shared with us at an event. It was really touching. So I'm going to mention self-harm here. So if you need to skip ahead or stop the video, just know that that topic's coming up, but it is kind of a happy ending too. So I'll just let you know that. So one of our Sangha members is a hairdresser, and he had a client come in, one that he's seen before. He knew she was on the schedule, and she can be very difficult, very demanding. Do this, do that. I don't like this. Don't do that. But he just thought, I'm just going to kind of mentally, from my side of things, start over with this person. I don't really know what's going on with them. I don't know why they're difficult, but I'm sure it's really nothing to do with me. It's just kind of the way that they are. And there's no reason for me to take it personally and actually get into conflict with this person, right? I'm just going to cut their hair. I'm just going to go with the flow. So he does that, gives her the haircut. She thanks him. She leaves. A few weeks later, it's time for another haircut. She comes back in. And she says to him, "Thank you for being so kind to me at my last haircut. I came in that day and I was going to get my haircut and then I was going to go home and kill myself. But because you were kind to me, I realized that I didn't need to do that." You don't necessarily know how your actions are going to affect those around you. But if they're positive, if they're well-meant, if they're not self-serving, if it's not about being right, but being helpful and kind, what else can you ask for in the world, in this world? So I think about that kind of thing a lot when the world comes up, the interconnectedness of everything. We have a circle here. We have the heavens and the earth. Everything interacts with everything and everything else. And we are all on this planet together. So all of our actions affect everything else around us, whether we can see it right away or not. I don't really know how to make a smooth transition out of that into what else I wanted to say. I guess I just wanted to wrap up the deck itself. So where does that leave us with the Dame Fortune's Wheel? First, I want to thank Esther for the Drop 'em 78 challenge. She's over at Mindful Tarot. This was an exercise that really helped me focus and really investigate this deck and read this book cover to cover, which I probably would not have done otherwise if I hadn't had this challenge. I think it's a great challenge, the Drop 'em 78, to do with a deck that is tricky, that is unfamiliar, that maybe has a different system. I would recommend it if you're interested in that. To me, it's not about memorizing the cards through the 78 days. It's about exploring the guidebook It's about forcing yourself to sit down and find connections with the cards, whether they're, it's symbolism or the drawing style or the art style or something that's said in the guidebook that really resonates, or doesn't resonate, pushes back on you, and you're like, that's ridiculous. I think all of that is very helpful in doing an exercise like this and really going through each card one by one. Rather than just relying, a lot of times when I get a new deck, I don't sit down and just go through the cards one by one and read the guidebook cover to cover. I just start reading with it. And, if something doesn't make sense to me, I might look in the guidebook, but I just kind of read with it. And doing it that way, you're not getting exposed to all of the cards, because there will be many cards that don't come up over the course of even many readings. So this was helpful, really helpful. It was also exhausting. And, making 78 videos, I didn't have to do that, but I thought it would be a fun exercise, and it would also be, a good public accountability to make the videos every day. But it was exhausting, and I got burned out. And that's part of the reason I haven't been making a lot of videos lately, was just that took a lot out of me. And I would say maybe if you do this challenge, certainly don't feel pressured to share about it necessarily, because doing that every day is a lot. You could just take a picture of the card and write some notes in a journal and, reflect on it later if you wanted to. In terms of this specific deck and this specific writing, so I had a lot of problems with the art on the cards, as it turned out. Some of the ones I've shown you are actually ones that I like the depictions, but others just don't make sense. And I also think that Paul Hewson was trying to do way too much in this deck. So he's got 3 different systems, basically, that he's put together. He's got historic majors. He's got historic / allegorical / mythological court cards, which are a mess. And I believe those are from, old French style fortune telling associations for playing cards, Atea style stuff. So it's not Hewson's fault that they're a mess, but they are. And then he's got the pip cards, which are from the Atea meanings. And those meanings really, in a few cases, they shed interesting light on the cards. That 9 of coins is going to stay with me forever. But other ones, were more or less helpful. And really what I was getting more from was the guidebook, the descriptions in the guidebook, than I was from the imagery on the card. Because sometimes the imagery didn't exactly match, or it only conveyed one aspect of the card and didn't leave things open-ended in a visual way. Maybe the guidebook said, gave me 10 different keywords, but Hewson's cards were depicting one of them, and that particular depiction doesn't align with any of my other understandings about that card. So that part was quite difficult. So for that reason, I'm not going to be using the deck. I've decided to move this on. I don't know if you want my copy, feel free to let me know. I could send it to you. It does come with a little booklet. So while this is not as robust, obviously, as this, it will have keywords and things in it. Looks like it's in multiple languages. So yeah, it's just a few keywords per card. It's not a ton of stuff, but again, if you like this art style or you like weird decks or historic decks, let me know. But I will keep the guidebook, and I thought about this a lot. Because Hewson gives so many different keywords, upright and reversed meanings, it's not the characters necessarily and the historical source material that he used, because he based a lot of his images on other earlier Italian decks. It's really that those keywords, upright and reversed, some of the descriptions of the characters in the cards that have expanded meanings for some cards for me. And I'm not sure I'll remember all of that. I did take kind of abbreviated notes in my journal, but I think I'm going to hang on to this because I think it could be a good reference in the future. So I'm not quite ready to part with that. So that's my conclusion, which is that this is not a deck for me. And in some ways, it's not a guidebook for me either, but there's enough in here that's interesting and that pokes at some of the more standardized meanings that I've learned and helps me understand the cards in a better way. And I'm going to be filming a couple of sample readings that I've done recently, and at least one of those will have another example from Hewson's writing that was really helpful. So since I've been having those experiences, I know that this book is going to be helpful because it has been helpful. Not, again, to read Hewson's deck, which to me is kind of unreadable, but those keywords that he has have really opened up the meanings for cards for me in a whole new way in certain recent readings that I've had. So even though I was using a different deck, sometimes I would come back to Hewson's interpretations and keywords because they're fairly expansive. And there are positive, neutral, and negative words for most of the cards in here. Now, the Atea meanings that a lot of these are based on do repeat. So you have multiple cards that are about a message or a messenger. You have multiple cards that are about wealth or gold or inheritance. You have multiple cards that are about the home or the house or the town. You have multiple cards about celebration or feasting. It doesn't really differentiate very well as a deck between the 78. You don't always get separate meanings for each card. There's a lot of overlap. But that said, having access to this book and being able to pick and choose keywords based on what I'm seeing or not seeing in a reading, maybe I get a little stuck on a card. This is one of, several guidebooks that gives me juicy keywords that I haven't seen in other places. So for that reason, I'm going to keep the guidebook because it has opened up some recent readings, and I'm hoping to share some of those with you soon as well. I'll walk you through readings I've been doing for myself. So thank you again for being with me for this series. Let me know if you're thinking about doing the Drop in 78, or if you have the Dame Fortune's Wheel Tarot or experience with it or similar decks, let me know. Hopefully, not too long from now, I'll be back with some more videos. I have so many ideas. I've just wrapped up a couple of classes and some other things that have been taking up my time, and so I'm hoping to get back into videos. Again, I'm also just feeling more inspired after my Drop in 78 burnout to start recording again. So, hope you're all well, be good, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.